Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon, and in the last video of this chapter, we are going to learn about pollination and what happened after pollination, which is fertilization. So by the end of this video, you should be able to outline the process of pollination as well as distinguish, that means tell the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination, and describe the growth of pollen tube and its entry into the ovum, followed by fertilization. So for pollination, let us just recap what is the definition that you learned in the first video. Pollination is a transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma. There are two types of pollination. Self-pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grain within one individual flower. So it can be transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or the stigma of a different flower that is on the same plant. The important thing here is the transfer of pollen grain to the stigma of the same plant. But please take note, this one is often confused. Do you think that this is considered sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction? Pause and think. Now, let's think about this. Is there a fusion of gametes? If there is, that means it is actually sexual reproduction. So, pollen grain, which is the male sex gametes, will fuse or fertilize the ovum. So when this happens, there is actually fusion of gametes. So it is actually considered a sexual reproduction, even though it is only one parent. So as mentioned, sexual reproduction can actually have one parent instead of two. As long as there's fusion of gametes, it is considered sexual reproduction and the offspring will be dissimilar. It might not be as dissimilar as cross-pollination, but still, the offspring will be slightly different from the parents. For cross-pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains to stigma of another plant. Of course, it has to be the same species. If not, the pollen grain will not germinate. So the difference between cross-pollination is the pollen grain is transferred to the stigma of another plant. Self-pollination, same plant. That is the main difference. But both are considered sexual reproduction. So what are the advantages of self-pollination? So if the parents have beneficial trait, that means good traits or good characteristic, for example, it attracts a lot of insects, the offspring will most likely inherit the trait. And only one parent is required. So if there's only one individual left, it can still ensure the survival of the species by self-pollinating. And because it's self-pollination, the chances of successful pollination is higher. So less pollen grain and energy is wasted. It does not have to depend on external factors such as insect and wind. And it is likely to take place because of the close proximity of stigma and anther. The disadvantage is the genetic variation of offspring of the species is low. So if there's a change of environment to something that's hostile to the current batch of plant, most likely they will not survive because they are too similar. And of course, if there are harmful genes, they can be passed on to their offspring. Now, before we move to cross-pollination, it is worth noting that for cross-pollination, you will see more disadvantage. But just bear in mind that having more disadvantage doesn't mean it's not the preferred choice. Because when we talk about disadvantage, some disadvantage can be a major one, some can be minor. For cross-pollination, those disadvantage is most likely minor disadvantage compared to the major disadvantage of low genetic variation. Because for species that have low genetic variation, it's very difficult for them to adapt to changes in the environment. So when there's an environment change, most of them will become dead. So for cross-pollination, there's more genetic variation in offspring. That means higher chance that some will survive when there's a change in environment. And for those that survive, they can repopulate the area. And offspring can inherit beneficial trait from both the parents. So for example, the father have these good traits, maybe pest resistant. The mom maybe have this trait of producing a lot of ovules, so more seed can be generated. There's also a lower probability of harmful traits being expressed in the offspring, and normally the seed produced are capable of surviving longer before germination. For the disadvantage is two plants of the same species are required, so good luck trying to find a partner if you are alone. And it depends on external factors such as insect or wind, and of course the chance of pollination happening is lower, so more energy is wasted, and due to the higher chance involved, it is less likely to occur compared to self-pollination. But like I said, even though it have more disadvantage like waste energy and so on, when it comes to survival in the long run, when there's a change in environment, having cross-pollination is definitely the more likely scenario whereby a species can survive, because there will be individuals who are more adapted to the new environment that will survive and reproduce. So because of the disadvantage of self-fertilization, plants have features to prevent this. So for example, the anther and the stigma will mature at different time. So if the pollen grain happens to fall onto the stigma, because the stigma is not mature, it will not cause the pollen grain to germinate. Some flower have anther and stigma situated on different flower, so this will reduce the chance of self-pollination. And you can see the flower down here, the stigma is actually above the anther. This will help to reduce the chance of self-pollination, because if the pollen grain were to fall, it will not fall onto the stigma since the stigma is taller. So these are some of the features which the plant took to prevent self-pollination. After pollination, what will take place is fertilization. So when the pollen grain lands onto the stigma or a mature stigma, the fluid in the stigma will help to cause the pollen grain to germinate. So the pollen tube will grow out from the pollen grain down the style towards the ovule. Enzyme will be secreted, which will help to digest the surrounding tissue of the stigma and style, forming the pollen tube. So after the pollen tubes grow all the way to the ovules, it will enter it through the micropyle and release the male gametes. After the release of the male gametes, it will fuse with the ovule, forming a zygote. So this is what happened after pollination, the germination of pollen tube, followed by fertilization. So take note of the sequence of events, they are important. And finally, this one is more of a good to know. What do different parts of the flower become? The ovary will grow into the whole fruit. The ovum, which house the ovum, will become the seed of the fruit. So after fertilization, ovum will develop into the seed, ovary into the fruit, and the zygote will develop into the embryo. And zygote is formed when the ovum fused with the nucleus of the pollen grain or the male gametes. So the zygote is in the seed. The seed contains the nutrients, which is something like the egg yolk. So this will be all for this chapter.